Hello coders, welcome to Coding Every Day. This is another episode of the Asta Manager project series. In this episode, we will see how we can use static web apps to merge the front end and the back end together, and also how to add some authentication to our application. Before we do that, let's address some of the issues that you might have had in the previous episode. One thing that comes to mind is that maybe you don't have the .NET Core, the .NET 5 SDK installed, so you might need to install that. Also, if you use Visual Studio Code, you might want to install the Azure Functions Core tool, so you can run functions from command line. And another thing that you need as a dependency of that is the Azure Storage Emulator. Let me open this documentation page. As you can see, the Azure Storage Emulator has been deprecated in favor of the Azure IT Emulator. In my case, I have Azure Storage Emulator already installed. If not, you can follow the instructions on the documentation pages. How to install Azure it locally. Essentially, it's just a command line from npm, and then how to run it locally, which is also quite simple. It's just a command line after that. I will put the links in the description for all of this. And also for this episode, what we need the static web app CLI. So let me grab the documentation for that, and we'll see how to install that in just a second. So as you can see, the installation is quite simple. It's just an npm command. You can run this. I already ran it, so you don't have to wait for me just to install stuff. How static web apps work though? So essentially what static web apps is a reverse proxy that based on the URL of on the path rather of your requests, it will direct traffic to the backend or the front end or the authentication server. So for example, if your app starts with if the path of your request starts with API/something, it will go to your API. If it starts with .auth/something, it will go to the authentication server. And if it's something else, then it will try to go to the static content website. And that's pretty much it. Of course, locally, the authentication and authorization server is just an emulator, is just a mockup. But once we deploy that into production, it will be a proper server, and you will be able to actually use proper authentication from the providers that you decide to configure this with. Okay, let's get started. So first thing we need, now that we have, so I assume that you've run the command to this command to start this command to install the static web apps CLI. And now that you have that installed, you can run this command once you have both the front end and the back end running. I will stop down those and just start them again. So yeah, we don't need that for now. And then you can run this command that will run on this front end with API this other website. So let's run that. Sorry, we need SWA start. My bad. And as you can see, now it started with the static content on this URL and the API server on this backend. Let's see how it looks in the browser. So if we go to localhost 4280, we can see that everything still works, and our backend call is still it's still to the straight to localhost 7071, which means that the request goes straight to the Azure Functions. So let's change that. Okay, let's do that from Visual Studio Code because there are quite simple changes. So I will add the API folder to the workspace here. And then if we open local JSON, we won't need the course anymore. So we can remove that now. And in the front end, we can remove this. So it will call the local path API hello. So let's restart the functions. I assume that React is hot reloading, but let's restart it anyway. Okay, and now if we refresh this page, which is the static web app one, you will see that everything works. You don't need course anymore because the call to the hello function is local to this website, so it's on port 4280, which is great. Now let's see how you can authenticate. So in order to see if you are authenticated, you can go to this URL, and in this case you see that I'm already authenticated because I did a previous run of this video, and then I had some problems. But if I go and clear the site data and I refresh the page, I don't have the authentication anymore, just so I'm in the same position as you guys. So let's add the login button so that we can at least trigger the login. In our app, in the navigation, we add a button here. This is quite a simple, straightforward button, and we save that, and of course it hot reloaded, and maybe not. Where is our button? Okay, so we have our button, and you can click login and it will go to your provider. In this case Twitter. I can select a random name here. I believe my Twitter is this one, but I will double check with you guys and will put it in the description. This is just locally anyway, so it doesn't matter what you put there. Okay, so now that we are logged in, nothing changed visually because we didn't put anything, but if we go to /me, we see that we have some information here. So we have a client principal object, and inside we have a client ID, user roles, identity provider, user details. Great. So let's grab this information in the console app so we can see some changes on the page. So first thing we need is to define the type of the authenticated user, in our case user ID, roles, identity provider, and user details. And we also need some code to fetch this on page load. So we have a loading state to identify if we are loading the state from the /auth/me path, and we also have the state of the user itself. We have also this fetch method that essentially it says loading to true. It grabs the information from the auth me path, and it stores that in the user eventually, and then it says loading to false. So far is great. We also need to call this method obviously in here so that when the component is loaded we run that. And in order to see some differences, I will also change the login button to be more dynamic. So we will have a login button or so we have the login button that is disabled if we are loading information, and it will show loading. Otherwise it will show login as text, but is anyway disabled. We also have a logout button in case we already have a user. So in case we already have a user defined locally, it will show the logout button, and of course if we are loading we still show the loading instead of the logout. And we also display the username from the user object that we saved in the state. So that sounds great. Let's see how it looks. So if we go back to this page and we refresh, we have logout and the username, and then login, and we can log in, and then we have. So this is great, but one question that you might have is, how do I get what user is currently logged in the Azure Functions backend? That's a good question, and the answer is you get a header where the information is stored in base64. So in order to address that, I would open Visual Studio just because I find it easier to work with. So in Visual Studio, we create static class that is just responsible for parsing this information from the header. So let's add that. My PC is quite slow at the moment. I didn't want that name for the function, but I can rename it. Yes. And this is a public static class, and I will paste in the content just because I don't want you guys to see me typing all this. I think it's quite boring for you to see, but you can see that all that we are doing is using namespaces that we already from DLLs that we already have, from dependencies that we already use. So essentially we are reading from this header, and of course if we have value and we try to convert it from base64 string, and we have a decoded bytes array. From the bytes we transform that into a string which is our JSON, and from JSON we deserialize it as client principal. Okay, so then from the client principal we remove the anonymous role. We don't really need that, and we also map the user ID to the name identifier of the claims and the user details to the name. So this is quite simple and straightforward, and we can use it in our function. So principal static web out parse, and we just pass in the request, and now we have our principal. And what we can do here, we can interpolate this, and so let's put it there. So if we have a principal and identity is also not null, then we grab the name, and we can grab the identity name here because we mapped the user details to the name claims type. And let's see how this is looking. So in here I will just stop and start again my functions just to make sure it's updated. Hopefully it won't take too long. Okay, let's go to the website and refresh the page, and we see welcome functions, and we can log out, and obviously we don't have the user anymore. And voila, so we have the static web app that is doing the authentication for us. We also have both the front end and the back end that both respond on the same URL, so we don't need to worry about course and stuff like that. And we also are able to identify if the user is authenticated in the front end and also in the back end. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and make sure you put a thumbs up and you subscribe so you don't lose any future episode. So thank you for being with me, and see you next time. Bye, coders.